Federal agents tracked the sailboat for miles before surrounding it offshore, and when they finally boarded it, the entire vessel was sealed off as a floating crime scene. At the center of the investigation was a woman who vanished at sea without a trace, and a husband whose story only became more suspicious as investigators pulled apart the timeline. But what changed everything was the discovery that the boat may not have been empty the night she disappeared, because hidden across the vessel were multiple cameras, electronic logs, satellite records, and investigators believe some of that data may still exist. Then came another revelation. Lynette Hooker's daughter publicly claimed her mother had once been threatened with the exact fate investigators were now examining. This case involves disturbing allegations of domestic violence, suspicious behavior, and an active criminal investigation currently unfolding. Viewer discretion is advised. If you follow real true crime investigations, maritime mysteries, and cases where digital evidence could expose the truth years later, subscribe and turn on notifications. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from tonight. Lynette Hooker had spent years building a life around the water. Friends and family described her as adventurous, independent, and deeply comfortable at sea. Long before investigators and news crews began focusing on the sailboat Soulmate, Lynette and her husband Brian had documented parts of their traveling lifestyle online while moving through coastal areas and island routes across the Bahamas. To outsiders, the couple appeared experienced. They had spent years sailing together, learning weather patterns, navigation systems, and long-distance travel on open water. Family members said Lynette was not someone unfamiliar with the risks that came with life at sea. That detail would later become important as investigators examined Brian Hooker's version of events. Lynette was also known for staying closely connected with family, despite spending long periods traveling. Her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, remained one of the people closest to her. According to family interviews, communication between Lynette and Carly had continued regularly during the couple's travels. Those conversations helped paint a clearer picture of Lynette's emotional state in the months leading up to her disappearance. By early 2026, Lynette and Brian had reportedly been married for around 25 years. But behind the sailing videos and travel updates, family members would later describe growing tension inside the relationship. Carly publicly stated that the marriage had experienced periods of instability, including separations and reconciliations over the years. Those closest to Lynette said she often tried to keep personal problems private. Still, concerns about the relationship had reportedly surfaced long before April 2026. Carly later claimed there had been previous arguments serious enough to alarm family members, including allegations tied to controlling behavior and past confrontations inside the marriage. Investigators would eventually review a 2015 police incident report connected to the couple in Michigan. While details surrounding the incident were limited publicly, the report became part of the broader effort to understand the history of the relationship before Lynette disappeared. At the same time, Brian Hooker publicly maintained through legal representatives that he had done nothing wrong. His attorneys consistently pushed back against growing speculation as public attention around the case intensified online and across national news coverage. But outside the legal statements, another reality was beginning to take shape. Family members close to Lynette were no longer looking at the disappearance as a simple accident at sea. They believed the problems inside the marriage mattered, and investigators appeared to believe those concerns were worth examining closely as the case continued developing. By the beginning of 2026, the couple had continued traveling through the Bahamas aboard Soulmate, moving between islands while documenting parts of their sailing life online. From the outside, little appeared unusual. But according to later interviews with family members, communication patterns between Lynette and those closest to her had started changing in subtle ways during the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Carly Ellsworth would later say there were moments when her mother seemed emotionally distant and under pressure. While Lynette still stayed in contact, family members reportedly sensed tension beneath the surface. At times, conversations that once felt normal now seemed shorter and more guarded. Earlier that year, Carly had also spent time aboard Soulmate herself. That visit would later become significant because it gave investigators and the public a clearer understanding of the environment Lynette had been living in before she disappeared. According to Carly, the atmosphere between Brian and Lynette did not feel stable. She later described periods where the couple appeared emotionally disconnected despite continuing to travel together. As the sailboat moved through the Elbow Cay Islands, family members back in the United States continued receiving updates from Lynette. But investigators would later examine whether those communications reflected deeper problems developing inside the marriage during the final weeks before April 4th. At the center of those concerns were allegations that the relationship had become increasingly strained over time. Carly publicly claimed that previous arguments between Brian and Lynette had gone far beyond ordinary marital conflict. According to her statements, there had been moments in the past where Lynette allegedly described behavior that deeply alarmed family members. Those allegations became even more serious after Carly claimed Brian had once threatened that Lynette could disappear at sea and never be found. Investigators would later become aware of those statements as the criminal investigation expanded. Brian's attorneys, however, strongly denied any wrongdoing and continued maintaining that Lynette's disappearance was a tragic accident. Meanwhile, witnesses connected to the sailing community began providing investigators with additional context surrounding the couple's movements before Lynette vanished. Authorities worked to establish a clearer timeline of where Soulmate had traveled, who may have interacted with the couple, and whether anything unusual had been noticed in the days before the disappearance. As investigators reconstructed the couple's route through the Bahamas, one detail remained impossible to ignore. Lynette Hooker was considered an experienced sailor who understood open water, weather conditions, and vessel safety. That fact alone would become central to the growing questions surrounding what Brian Hooker claimed happened on the night of April 4th. On April 4th, 2026, Lynette Hooker disappeared somewhere near Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. What exactly happened during those final hours remains the central question investigators have been trying to answer ever since. According to Brian Hooker, the two were traveling back towards Soulmate in an inflatable dinghy after spending time ashore. He later claimed conditions on the water had become rough, with stronger wind and waves building as night approached. During that trip back to the sailboat, Brian said, Lynette suddenly fell into the water. Brian told authorities that Lynette had possession of the emergency engine cutoff lanyard attached to the dinghy. According to his explanation, when she went overboard, the engine immediately shut down, leaving him drifting in difficult conditions without power. He claimed he attempted to recover Lynette, but could no longer see her in the darkness and rough water. Investigators would later focus heavily on the timeline that followed. Brian stated that after the engine stopped, he spent hours trying to paddle the dinghy through worsening conditions before eventually reaching shore near Marsh Harbor during the early morning hours of April 5th. Authorities say he later reported Lynette missing after reaching land. As search efforts began, investigators started reconstructing the sequence of events minute by minute. They examined weather conditions, water movement, distances between locations, vessel positioning, and the estimated timeline Brian provided to authorities. Almost immediately, certain questions began surfacing. Investigators wanted to determine exactly when Lynette was last seen, whether any nearby vessels had witnessed activity in the area, and whether electronic systems aboard Soulmate could help verify parts of Brian's account. The location itself also complicated the investigation. Open water near the Elbow Cay Islands can become unpredictable quickly, especially after dark. Search teams had to account for currents, visibility, weather conditions, and the possibility that Lynette had drifted far from the original reported location. But even in the early stages of the investigation, the case was already moving beyond a standard missing person report. Authorities were not only trying to locate Lynette, they were also attempting to determine whether the timeline they had been given matched the available evidence. And as investigators began collecting information from witnesses, vessel tracking systems, and onboard electronics, the scrutiny surrounding Brian Hooker's version of events only continued to grow. If cases like this matter to you, cases where families are still searching for answers and investigators are still trying to uncover the truth, subscribe and stay with us, because some stories should never be forgotten. Within hours of Lynette being reported missing, authorities in the Bahamas launched search operations across the surrounding waters near Elbow Cay. What began as a rescue mission quickly expanded into a much larger, coordinated effort involving multiple agencies, aircraft, and marine search teams. Bahamian officials were joined by the United States Coast Guard as crews searched sections of open water surrounding the reported location of the incident. Aircraft monitored large areas from above, while marine units focused on possible drift paths based on ocean current models and weather conditions from the night Lynette disappeared. Search teams also examined reports coming from nearby boaters and individuals who may have been in the area that evening. Investigators reviewed witness statements involving possible lights, movement on the water, and reports of activity near vessels anchored around the Elbow region. As the operation continued, another shift quietly began taking place behind the scenes. Rescue teams were still searching for Lynette, but investigators were simultaneously starting to examine whether the case involved more than an accident at sea. One detail that drew attention was the amount of time between Lynette's reported disappearance and the larger emergency response that followed. Investigators began carefully reconstructing Brian Hooker's movements after he claimed Lynette fell overboard, including the hours he allegedly spent attempting to return to shore. Questions also began forming around activity aboard Soulmate after the reported incident. According to later public discussions surrounding the case, investigators became interested in determining what happened on the vessel during the hours after Lynette disappeared and before authorities fully secured the scene. Meanwhile, family members back in the United States were desperately trying to understand what had happened. As information slowly emerged through media coverage and official statements, Carly Ellsworth and other relatives began publicly expressing doubts about the circumstances surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Public attention around the case intensified even further when search operations shifted from rescue efforts toward recovery operations. That transition signaled a painful reality for Lynette's family and also marked a turning point in the broader investigation. Then another important detail surfaced. Authorities confirmed that federal investigators were now directly involved in the case. What had started as a missing person search in Bahamian waters was rapidly evolving into an international criminal investigation, with growing attention focused on the sailboat Soulmate and the electronic evidence investigators believed could still exist on board. As public suspicion surrounding the case continued growing, attention increasingly shifted toward one critical question: what evidence might still exist aboard Soulmate itself? Investigators soon learned that the sailboat was equipped with multiple blink security cameras positioned around sections of the vessel. Those cameras immediately became one of the most important aspects of the entire investigation because of how the system stores and transfers footage. Unlike older onboard recording systems that save everything locally, blink cameras can upload footage remotely through internet-connected cloud storage. That detail changed the direction of the investigation almost overnight. Authorities were no longer only examining the physical condition of the boat. They were now looking into whether digital records may have preserved activity from the night Lynette disappeared, At the center of that effort was Soulmate's onboard internet system. Investigators began examining the possibility that the vessel's Starlink satellite connection may have transmitted data, timestamps, or cloud uploads during critical periods of the timeline. If footage had uploaded remotely, authorities could potentially reconstruct movement on board, even if physical recordings were altered or deleted later. The investigation into the vessel's electronics quickly expanded beyond camera footage alone. Authorities also began looking into onboard battery systems, electrical activity logs, and timestamp data that might help establish when certain systems aboard the boat were active. Another major focus became the vessel's AIS system, short for Automatic Identification System, which transmits positioning information used to track vessel movement. Investigators and maritime analysts began examining reports of potential AIS interruptions connected to Soulmate around the timeline of Lynette's disappearance. That detail sparked growing discussion online because AIS systems are commonly used to monitor vessel location, route history, and nearby marine traffic. Investigators would later work to determine whether available tracking records aligned with Brian Hooker's account of what happened that night. At the same time, federal authorities were reportedly expanding efforts to identify anyone who may have seen Soulmate during the critical hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance. Investigators specifically sought information connected to another sailboat believed to have been near the area around the same time. As more digital and maritime evidence came under review, the case was beginning to move into far more complex territory. Investigators were no longer relying solely on witness accounts or timelines provided during interviews. They were now examining whether electronics, tracking systems, and cloud-based records could independently confirm or contradict what happened aboard Soulmate during the final hours before Lynette vanished. As federal investigators continued reviewing evidence connected to Soulmate, public scrutiny surrounding Brian Hooker intensified. Questions were no longer focused only on the night Lynette disappeared. Attention had now shifted toward Brian's behavior in the hours and days that followed. One detail that drew major attention came from individuals connected to the sailing community who questioned why Brian allegedly remained aboard Soulmate for an extended period after Lynette vanished instead of immediately triggering a larger emergency response. Friend and fellow sailor Blaine Stevenson publicly criticized the timeline, arguing that several decisions made afterward did not align with what many experienced boaters would expect during a genuine emergency at sea. Those concerns quickly spread online as investigators continued examining vessel activity, digital records, and communication logs connected to the case. Family members also continued speaking publicly, with Carly Ellsworth repeatedly stating she did not believe her mother's disappearance was simply an accident. Meanwhile, federal authorities quietly escalated the investigation behind the scenes. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, working alongside other agencies, began treating Soulmate as a potential floating crime scene. Surveillance operations tracked the vessel before federal agents ultimately boarded and secured it for forensic examination. Once investigators gained access to the boat, attention reportedly focused heavily on electronic systems, onboard devices, communication records, and any recoverable digital evidence tied to the timeline of April 4th. Authorities also worked to preserve chain of custody for anything removed from the vessel as part of the criminal investigation. At the same time, investigators publicly requested information about another sailboat believed to have been near Soulmate around the time Lynette disappeared. Authorities hoped witnesses or nearby boaters might provide additional context, capable of confirming movement patterns, lighting activity, or interactions on the water. During the critical hours, investigators were trying to reconstruct. Despite growing suspicion surrounding the case, Brian Hooker continued denying wrongdoing through attorneys. His legal team maintained that Lynette's disappearance was a tragic accident and pushed back against accusations spreading publicly online. Officials also emphasized that the investigation remained active and ongoing, while formal criminal charges had not been publicly announced. But by that point, the investigation had already evolved far beyond a standard missing person case. Authorities were examining surveillance systems, satellite internet activity, vessel tracking data, witness timelines, and forensic evidence collected directly from Soulmate itself. And investigators still appeared to be searching for answers to several major unresolved questions. Could electronic records establish a more precise timeline of activity aboard the boat? Did cloud-based systems preserve footage from the night Lynette disappeared? Why did certain reported movements and timelines continue drawing investigative attention? And what information, if any, might still be held by witnesses or nearby vessels that had not yet come forward publicly? For Lynette's family, those unanswered questions remained impossible to escape. Carly Ellsworth and Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, continued publicly calling for accountability and transparency as the investigation moved forward. While authorities worked to piece together the final known movements surrounding Lynette's disappearance, her family remained focused on one goal: finding out exactly what happened in the waters near Elbow Cay that night. Today, the case remains one of the most closely watched maritime investigations in recent memory. Federal authorities have continued reviewing evidence connected to Soulmate, while public interest surrounding the disappearance remains high across the United States and the Bahamas. And until investigators fully reconstruct what happened aboard that sailboat on April 4th, 2026, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains surrounded by uncertainty, suspicion, and unanswered questions that continue to grow with every new development. Real investigations like this don't get the attention they deserve unless people keep talking about them. So, if you want more deep-dive true crime documentaries built on facts, evidence, and real cases, subscribe and join us. In the months following Lynette Hooker's disappearance, the investigation continued expanding across multiple jurisdictions, while federal authorities reviewed evidence collected from Soulmate and related digital systems. Public attention surrounding the case only intensified as investigators remained careful about revealing exactly what evidence had been recovered or what conclusions they may have reached privately. One of the biggest unanswered questions continued surrounding the boat's electronic systems. Investigators were believed to be examining whether camera footage, satellite records, timestamp data, and onboard electronics could help establish a clearer reconstruction of activity during the final hours before Lynette vanished. Maritime analysts following the case also continued discussing the importance of AIS tracking records and whether any interruptions in vessel data could become significant later in the investigation. At the same time, authorities remained interested in identifying potential witnesses connected to nearby vessels in the area that night. Federal investigators publicly requested information involving another sailboat believed to have been close to Soulmate around the timeline of the disappearance. Investigators hoped anyone who may have seen lights, movement, or unusual activity on the water could help narrow remaining gaps in the timeline. Meanwhile, Brian Hooker remained publicly silent outside statements issued through attorneys. His legal team continued maintaining that Lynette's disappearance was a tragic accident and strongly rejected suggestions of criminal wrongdoing. Officials also repeated that the case remained an active investigation and emphasized that no formal public conclusion had been announced. For Lynette's family, however, the uncertainty never disappeared. Carly Ellsworth continued speaking publicly about her mother while urging investigators to keep pushing forward. Darlene Hamlet also remained active in interviews and public discussions surrounding the case, repeatedly calling for answers about what happened near Elbow Cay on April 4th, 2026. As media coverage spread nationally, the case became one of the most discussed maritime investigations in recent years. Partly because of the unusual combination of open water mystery, alleged relationship problems, and potential digital forensic evidence. Unlike many older missing person cases at sea, investigators now had access to technology capable of preserving movement records, cloud uploads, electronic timestamps, and communication history in ways that did not exist years earlier. But despite the growing attention and ongoing analysis, one fact remained unchanged. Lynette Hooker was never recovered, and the full sequence of events from that night still has not been publicly established. Today, the investigation remains open, with authorities continuing to review evidence connected to the disappearance. And until investigators fully determine what happened aboard Soulmate, the case continues to stand as a disturbing reminder of how quickly uncertainty, suspicion, and unanswered questions can surround a disappearance at sea. With investigators still reviewing evidence and the public continuing to follow the case closely, many of the central questions surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance remain unresolved. Authorities have not publicly disclosed the full extent of the forensic analysis connected to Soulmate, and investigators have remained careful about discussing what digital evidence may or may not have been recovered from the vessel. What is publicly known, however, is that the case evolved far beyond a routine missing person investigation within days of Lynette vanishing. The involvement of federal agencies, the seizure of the sailboat, the focus on electronic records, and the growing scrutiny surrounding the timeline all pointed toward an investigation that authorities appeared to be treating with increasing seriousness. For many following the case, one of the most unsettling aspects remains the role technology may ultimately play in uncovering the truth. Investigators today are no longer limited to witness statements alone. Camera systems, cloud storage, satellite internet activity, onboard electronics, and vessel tracking systems can preserve information long after people stop talking. And in cases involving open water, where physical evidence can disappear quickly, those digital systems may become critical pieces of the investigation. At the same time, the emotional impact of the case continues to affect Lynette's family. Public interviews given by Carly Ellsworth and Darlene Hamlet reflected a family still searching for clarity while trying to understand how a sailing trip through the Bahamas turned into an international criminal investigation. Meanwhile, public interest in the case continues growing online as investigators remain active, and new details slowly emerge through reporting, maritime analysis, and official statements. Questions surrounding the timeline, vessel activity, and possible witness accounts continue fueling speculation across social media and true crime communities following the investigation closely. But despite the theories and public discussion, investigators have repeatedly emphasized that the case remains open and active. Authorities have not publicly released a final reconstruction of what happened aboard Soulmate on April 4, 2026, and several key questions remain unanswered. For now, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains a case defined by uncertainty, a missing woman, a disputed timeline, a sailboat treated as a crime scene, and a growing investigation shaped as much by digital evidence as traditional detective work. And until authorities fully determine what happened in the waters near Elbow Cay that night, the story of Lynette Hooker continues to stand as one of the most closely watched and deeply unsettling maritime investigations in recent memory. Behind every investigation like this is a family still waiting for answers. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive and bring attention to cases that people refuse to let disappear.